They sold the giant girl for being too tall and blind. But a rancher said, "You are God's." She stood a full 7 feet tall in a world that was built for smaller souls. Her eyes were forever dark in a land that worshipped sight, and her own blood, her own father, put a price on her head, like she was nothing more than a broken-down mare ready for the glue factory. Every decent person in that dusty auction yard should have walked away. They should have turned their backs on the whole sorry spectacle. But sometimes God sends his angels in a form so broken, so towering, so utterly impossible, that only one heart in 1,000 can recognize a miracle when it's standing right there in front of them, tied up with a rope. And that one heart belonged to a man named Silas Kurian. The auction yard stank. It was a thick, greasy smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and kicked-up dust that coated the back of your throat. Horses slammed their hooves against splintered stalls, men hollered numbers like they were curses, and the rattle of coins in leather pouches sounded like bones in a gambler's cup. But the laughter that echoed around the central corral wasn't for an animal. It was for her. A girl, barely 19, with a dirty blindfold tied tight across her eyes. She was barefoot in the filth, and a coarse rope was cinched cruelly around one wrist, as though she were something wild that needed to be broken. Her father, a bottle half empty dangling from his fist, dragged her into the center of the ring. He walked with a swagger that didn't come from pride. It came from the drink. "Too tall for any man to wed," he shouted, his words slurring together into a bitter mush. "Too blind to cook or clean without breaking half the place." He gave the rope a vicious tug. "But she don't talk back. Don't make a sound. Cheap labor, if you got the coin." A ripple of laughter tore through the crowd of men. It was a sharp, cutting sound, the kind that could wound a person deeper than any knife. Someone spat a wad of tobacco into the dirt near her feet. Another man, leaning on the fence rail with a greasy grin, called out, "Ain't no man gonna buy a mountain that can't see where she's steppin'." But she didn't flinch. She didn't cry out or plead or beg. Her face remained perfectly still, a mask of calm in a storm of cruelty. Her chin was lifted just enough to tell the world that even though she couldn't see their sneering faces, she could feel their hatred pressing in on her from every single side. And that's when everything changed. Silas Kurian stood at the edge of the corral, his hand resting on his worn leather belt buckle, his jaw locked so tight a tooth might crack. He was 35 years old, a man carved from silence and hard land. He hadn't planned on bidding for anything but a strong-backed horse. His ranch was quiet, his nights were long, and his heart was heavier than the cattle he drove across the plains. He had come to town for work, not for this violation. Yet, when her blindfolded face turned slowly, almost impossibly in his direction, something inside his chest went still. It was like the world stopped turning. It wasn't desperation she was aiming at him. It was something else. It was a kind of knowing, like she could see right through him without needing eyes. Like she had carried the exact shape of his loneliness in her own bones long before they ever met. Her father tugged the rope again, nearly yanking her off her feet. "Who's buying? I ain't dragging her back to my land. Worthless as dust on boots." A hush fell over the crowd, thick and heavy, and then the chuckles started again, low and mean. Men looked away, suddenly finding their boots very interesting. No one was willing to spend a single coin on her. Silas swallowed hard, his throat as dry as desert sand. His boots scraped against the hard-packed clay as he took one step forward. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it was mercy, maybe it was some kind of prairie madness. But the words were out of his mouth before he could stop them. "I'll take her." The crowd exploded, not with cheers, but with howling, jeering laughter. The sound was sharp as barbed wire. "You buying livestock or starting a damn circus, Kurian?" one man barked. Another leaned heavily on the fence rail, that same rotten grin splitting his face. "Hope you got a ladder to kiss that one good night." Silas ignored them all. He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat, his movement steady and deliberate. He counted out the silver coins into her father's filthy, outstretched hand. It wasn't much. It was just enough for a good horse. It was nowhere near enough for a human soul. The drunk shoved the rope at him with a sneer that twisted his lips. "She's yours. Don't say I didn't warn you." As he let go, the girl stumbled, her balance lost. Instinctively, she shifted her towering frame to stand just behind Silas, the rope now hanging slack in his calloused hand. Her rough-spun shawl slipped from one shoulder, revealing skin marked by a lifetime of being treated as less than human. But it also revealed shoulders that were strong, even as they trembled. Silas didn't hesitate. He worked the rough knot with his fingers and let the rope fall into the dust. It coiled there like a dead snake. He looked back once, just once, at the mocking faces in the crowd, at the men who found sport in suffering. Then he turned his back on them without a word. His new horse, the one he'd actually come for, snorted and stamped its feet in a nearby pen. The girl followed softly behind him, each step careful and deliberate, as if she had chosen this exact moment, in this exact place, to trust him. It was a trust she had given to no one else. By the time he reached his wagon at the edge of town, the jeers had faded into the distance, just a bad memory on the wind. He lifted her gently into the back. She was heavy with muscle, not fat, and he placed her on a pile of burlap sacks. He covered her with a thick wool blanket, and for a long moment, their shared silence filled the air, bigger and more real than any of the noise back at the auction. Then, so faintly he almost missed it, her fingers brushed against the sleeve of his coat. It was just once, a whisper of a touch that said more than words ever could. It said thank you. It said I see you. It said I am here. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He simply clicked the reins, and the wagon creaked out of town, its wheels grinding a slow path on the road beneath them. Behind him, the girl curled into the corner, her blindfolded face lifted toward the unseen horizon. She couldn't see it, but she didn't look back. Neither did he. Out there, beyond the reach of mocking eyes and cruel laughter, a man and a girl that nobody wanted began the slow, silent journey toward something even they couldn't yet name. But the peace didn't last. Silas felt it first as a prickle on the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched. He glanced at the girl, Emmeline. She was still as a statue, but her head was cocked, listening, not with her ears, with her whole body. The wagon rolled on for another mile, the sun beating down, the only sound the creak of the wheels and the plodding of the horse. Then he saw them. 2 riders, cresting a hill behind them, moving fast. They weren't ranchers. They were dressed in dark coats, despite the heat, and they rode with a purpose that made the hairs on Silas's arms stand on end. They weren't trying to be subtle. They were hunting. He clucked at the horse, urging it into a trot. The wagon bounced and rattled, but the riders behind gained ground with an unnatural speed. They were closing the distance, and Silas knew, deep in his gut, this wasn't a random robbery. They were after her. "Hold on," he said, his voice low and tight. Emmeline didn't respond, but her hands gripped the wooden sides of the wagon bed, her knuckles turning white. She knew. Of course she knew. The riders were almost on them now. Silas could see their faces, grim and set, their eyes fixed on the girl in the back of his wagon. He reached under his seat, his hand closing around the familiar cold steel of the rifle he kept there. He hadn't used it on a man in 10 years. He prayed today wouldn't break that streak. One of the riders pulled a pistol. A shot cracked through the air, splintering the wood just inches from Silas's head. The horse shrieked in terror and bolted, sending the wagon lurching wildly. Silas fought for control of the reins with one hand, leveling the rifle with the other. He was a good shot. He was more than a good shot. He was a man who knew how to end a fight quickly. But as he drew a bead on the lead rider, something impossible happened. Emmeline, who had been silent as the grave, opened her mouth. She didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She let out a sound. It was a low, resonant hum, almost too deep to hear, but Silas felt it in his bones, in his teeth. It vibrated through the wagon, through the very air itself. The lead rider's horse screamed and reared, its eyes rolling in terror. The man was thrown, landing hard in the dust. The second rider faltered, his own horse skittish and uncontrollable, spooked by a sound it couldn't understand. That was all the opening Silas needed. He fired once. Not at the man, but at the horse. The animal went down in a heap, trapping the rider's leg beneath it. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Silas slowed his panicked horse, bringing the wagon to a stop in a cloud of dust. He looked back at the two men, one struggling to get up, the other pinned and screaming. Then he looked at Emmeline. She was trembling, her chest heaving, the strange hum now silent. The blindfold was still in place, but her face was turned toward him. It was a question. Silas slid the rifle back into its hiding place. He looked at his own hands, steady and sure. He hadn't been that man, the man who could handle a gun like it was a part of his own arm, for a very long time. He had buried that man, but she had brought him back. "It's all right," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "We're safe." He didn't ask her about the sound. He didn't ask how she had done what she did. He just clicked the reins and got the wagon moving again, leaving the two men to their fate in the dust. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. The ranch was still miles away, and Silas Currion was beginning to understand that the whispers of her drunken father were true. He had bought a lot more than he bargained for. The girl wasn't just blind. She was something else entirely. And whatever she was, people were willing to kill to get their hands on her. The rest of the journey passed in a tense, thick silence. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. But no one else came for them. When they finally crested the last hill and saw the ranch spread out below, Silas felt a breath leave his body that he didn't even know he'd been holding. The place wasn't much. A small, sturdy house with a slanted roof, fences that leaned under the weight of years, and cattle scattered across the prairie like dark, moving stones. To Silas, it had always felt empty, a monument to what he'd lost. But as he helped Emmeline down from the wagon, the whole place seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. She stood taller than the porch beam, her borrowed shawl fluttering in the cold evening wind. She tilted her face toward the sound of the cattle lowing in the distance, and for the first time Silas thought she almost looked at peace, a strange, unsettling peace. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and bacon grease, the scent of a lonely life. He stoked the embers in the hearth, bringing a small fire back to life. He pointed toward the water kettle hanging by the fire. "Water," he said, his voice echoing in the small room. She moved without a moment's hesitation. Her bare feet made no sound on the wooden floor. She found the ladle, the tin cups, the water bucket, as if guided not by sight, but by a memory far older than the walls themselves. He watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. There was no blundering, no clumsy groping for objects. She just seemed to know where things belonged. It was unnatural. That night, after a simple meal of beans and bread eaten in complete silence, he set a piece of chalk on the rough-hewn table. He tapped the wooden doorframe, then pointed to himself. "Silas," he said clearly. Then he tapped the table in front of her. "Name." She hesitated for a long moment. Then she crouched, her body unfolding with a surprising grace. Her long, slender fingers took the chalk. With a steady hand, she wrote two things on the dusty floorboards. First, in slanted, surprisingly neat letters, she wrote a single word: Emmeline. He read it aloud once, then again, letting the sound roll around in his mouth. Emmeline. It was a good name. But he was so focused on the name, he almost missed the second thing she drew. Below her name, she sketched a small, simple symbol. It was a circle with a jagged line cutting through it, like a lightning bolt. Silas froze. His blood ran cold. He had seen that symbol before. Once, a long, long time ago. It was carved into the stock of a rifle, held by the man who had burned his last life to the ground. The man who had taken everything from him. He stared at the mark on the floor, then at the tall, silent girl who had drawn it. She stood without expression, her blindfolded face giving nothing away. Then, as if feeling his shock, she turned and stepped out of the cabin, disappearing into the darkness of the barn. He stayed at the table, his heart hammering against his ribs. The name echoed inside him, but the symbol screamed. Who was she? How could she possibly know that mark? It wasn't a coincidence. There were no coincidences out here on the prairie, only signs and omens, and this was a sign he couldn't ignore. The quiet, empty ranch no longer felt safe. It felt like the center of a storm, and the impossible, blind girl he'd brought home wasn't a victim. She was a message, a warning, and he had just invited her into his house. Days bled into one another, each one deepening the mystery that was Emmeline. She woke before the sun, her bare feet whispering across the dirt floor as she moved through the pre-dawn chores. Silas found her one morning with the mare he'd bought, the same one that had been spooked on the road. The horse had refused to eat, its legs swollen and tender from the strain of their escape. Yet Emmeline knelt beside it in the hay, a wet cloth in her hand, stroking its flank gently, her own breath slow and steady. She moved with a quiet patience, wrapping the animal's swollen limbs with clean rags soaked in some herbal concoction she'd made from weeds she'd found by the creek. Weeds Silas had never even noticed before. And to his utter astonishment, the horse stood as calm as a stone. There was no kicking, no fighting, just a deep, profound trust. He watched her from the doorway of the barn, his arms crossed, that strange, unsettling tug pulling at him again. She was blind, yet she saw the pain in the animal. She was mute, yet she spoke to it in a language of touch and stillness that it clearly understood. She listened, not with her ears, but with her whole being. And little by little, the silence that stretched between them began to shift. It was no longer empty. It was full of questions he was too afraid to ask. He never mentioned the symbol again. He scrubbed it from the floorboards, but he couldn't scrub it from his mind. He watched her, waiting for another sign, another clue. It came a week later. The first storm came to test them. It began as a nothing, just a warm, restless breeze at sundown. Silas thought little of it. He was busy stacking hay in the shed, trying to beat the coming dark. Then, suddenly, she was there. She appeared at his side as silently as a ghost, her dark hair wild around her face, her chest heaving as if she'd been running for miles. She grabbed his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong, and tugged with an urgent force. "What is it?" he asked, startled. She didn't write. She didn't sign. She only pointed a trembling finger straight up at the sky. A heartbeat later, a crack split the heavens. A bolt of white-hot lightning, thicker than a tree trunk, struck the massive oak tree that stood right behind the shed. The world exploded in a shower of fire and sparks. The force of the blast threw Silas backwards, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had been standing right where the tree's fiery branches now lay smoldering. She had known. Somehow, she had known before the air itself had changed. She had felt the electricity building in the clouds. She had run to warn him, to pull him from a danger that hadn't even existed a minute before. She had saved his life. That night, after the fire had died down to glowing embers and the rain had passed, he sat across from her at the small kitchen table. The lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. She wrote nothing on the floor. She made no sign. but when she reached out across the table and placed her calloused, strong hand over his, he understood. A debt had been paid. Trust had been exchanged, unspoken and binding. And yet, in that very same moment, as he began to see her incredible gift, the town began to whisper of curses. He knew it was coming. The two riders he'd left on the road would have made it back to wherever they came from. They would have told their story. And stories, in a town as small and isolated as theirs, spread faster than prairie fire. The whispers started at the blacksmith's forge, where men leaned close, their faces lit by the glow of the fire, muttering about the strange, giant girl Curion had bought. They said it wasn't right. At church, the women pulled their children closer when he walked past, their eyes darting away like frightened sparrows. They said she stared too long at the cattle, that the milk had soured 3 days after she arrived. They said she felt storms in her bones because she was in league with the devil who made them. They said she wasn't natural. It started small, like snowmelt dripping into the cracks of a foundation. A ranch hand's prize goat gave birth to a stillborn kid. She touched it, he swore to anyone who would listen. I saw her, just standing there, looking at it. A homesteader's boy took a terrible fever. His mother, desperate, had come to the ranch begging for help, having heard of Emmeline's way with the sick mare. Emmeline had brewed a tea from those strange creekside herbs, and the boy's fever had broken by morning. But relief quickly turned to suspicion. How'd she know what to give him? The mother whispered to her neighbors. What dark knowledge is that for a blind girl to have? Suspicion twisted her mercy into something menacing. Her silence became proof of her guilt. Her gift became a weapon they imagined she would use against them. 3 nights later, the whispers became footsteps. The crunch of heavy boots on the frosted ground outside Silas's gate was the only warning he got. 8 men stood there, their shoulders hunched against the cold. They held unlit torches, their breath pluming white in the frigid air. Their faces were stiff with something they wanted to call courage, but was really just plain, ugly fear. Old Man Withers, his voice a gravelly rasp from years of whiskey and dust, stepped forward. He was the town's unofficial leader, a man whose certainty was more dangerous than any weapon. We want her gone, Curion, he said flatly, his eyes hard as river stones. Silas stood in the barn doorway, his arms crossed, a dark shadow in the flickering lantern light. She's done nothing, he said, his voice even and low. She's mute, Withers snapped back, as if that were a crime. And she ain't deaf. She sees storms before they break. She handles beasts that have thrown every man in this county. That ain't natural. A low murmur rippled through the assembled crowd. One man spat defiantly in the dirt. Another shifted his grip on his torch, his thumb stroking the flint as if he were itching to strike a match. Inside the cabin, Emmeline stood behind the thin curtain of the window, watching. She had seen mobs like this before. She recognized the look in their eyes, their faces twisted not by pure hate, but by a fear so deep they had to pretend it was righteous certainty. She started to step forward, to face them herself, but Silas, without looking back, raised a single hand, stopping her. He walked out into the yard, his boots sinking into the thawing mud. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. He let his voice drop even lower, as steady and solid as the foundation of his house. You call her cursed, he said, his gaze moving from one man to the next, meeting their eyes and holding them. Then you've forgotten what a blessing looks like. She saved the Miller boy's life with her herbs. She calmed a mare that your blacksmith said should be put down. She's done more good in a month with her silence than most of you have done in a lifetime with all your endless talk. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to die down, holding its breath. Withers opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He saw the truth in Silas's eyes. He saw the shame in the eyes of the men standing beside him. One by one, they turned away. Their steps were heavy in the mud. The torches remained unlit. The gate creaked shut, and the ranch was quiet again. Quiet, save for the sound of the breath Silas hadn't even realized he was holding. Inside, the fire glowed low. Emmeline poured 2 tin cups of hot cider, setting one on the table in front of him. She then sat across from him in the flickering light. She didn't write. She didn't sign. After a long silence, she reached across the table and laid her hand on his. It wasn't a gesture of thanks. It was a gesture of recognition, of an alliance. In that moment, the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was a bond, steady and unspoken, and stronger than any mob. But as his hand rested under hers, Silas felt something else. A faint warmth spreading from her skin into his, and with it, a fleeting image flashed in his mind. A circle, with a jagged line cutting through it. She was showing him, telling him without words, that she knew he recognized the symbol. And that the mob wasn't the real threat. The real threat was still out there, and it was coming for them both. The winter locked them in. Snow crusted the fences, and the wind howled like a pack of wolves hunting the night. Life on Silas's ranch slowed to the rhythm of survival, each day measured by firewood stacked and cattle driven close to the shelter of the barn. Yet even in the hardest, bleakest stretch of that winter, Emmeline's presence turned the crushing silence into a strange kind of warmth. She was a constant, quiet fire in the heart of his home. He started teaching her simple signs, tracing the shapes in the palm of her hand. Water, fire, horse. Thank you. He fumbled at first, his own hands calloused and clumsy, but she was a quick study. She would gently take his fingers and correct the shape, guiding him, and he found himself smiling, a real smile, something he hadn't done in years. At night, they sat by the hearth. She would be stitching scraps of wool and leather into a thick, warm cloak, her needle moving with a sureness that defied her blindness. He would take out his old harmonica and play low, mournful tunes that echoed the sound of the wind outside. She never said if she could hear the music in any normal sense. She simply closed her eyes and swayed gently, as if the sound found some other road into her soul. For Silas, those quiet evenings became the kind of peace he had prayed for his whole life, without ever knowing it. But the town hadn't forgotten their fear. It had just gone dormant, like a snake hibernating under the frost. The whispers still clung to the well at the center of town and echoed in the pews of the church. They were just waiting for a reason to turn loud again. Then came the Sunday that sealed her fate. A boy went missing at dawn. Little Timmy Withers, the grandson of the very man who had led the mob. 7 years old. One of his small boots was found near the tree line at the edge of his family's property. There was no other sign, no tracks, no trail, just gone. Panic split the town in two. Mothers wailed in the street, men gathered with rifles and lanterns, shouting plans and casting blame. The dogs they brought barked uselessly, running in confused circles. It was as if the boy had simply vanished from the face of the earth. Silas grabbed his heavy coat, ready to ride out and join the search. He had to. But as he reached the door, Emmeline caught his arm, her grip firm. She shook her head slowly. She led him outside into the biting cold. She knelt in the dirt of their yard, placing her palms flat against the frozen ground. Her eyes, behind the blindfold, were closed in concentration. Silas watched, confused and impatient. Then she rose. She walked west a few steps toward the creek and knelt again, her fingers tracing invisible marks on the earth that no one else could see. A bent twig, a stone that had been shifted just so, a faint scuff in the frost, pressed there by a pair of small, terrified feet. She stood one last time and pointed. Her arm was steady as a compass needle, pointing not west, toward the tree line where everyone else was looking, but north, toward the unforgiving rocky hills. Silas didn't question her. He saddled his horse. The men in the search party laughed when he told them he was riding north. "There's nothing out there but rocks and snakes, Kurian," one shouted, but Silas ignored them. He rowed, and after a moment of hesitation, a few of the men, including a grim-faced Mr. Withers, followed him. They rode through thickets that tore at their clothes, over rocky ridges that tested their horses, and down into a dry creek bed that seemed to lead nowhere. Hours passed. The sun began to dip low in the sky, and even Silas started to have his doubts. Then they reached a clearing of gnarled cedar trees, and there, beneath the low-hanging branches of the oldest tree, the boy lay curled in a small hollow. His ankle was swollen and purple, his cheeks streaked with dirt and frozen tears, but he was alive. His mother, who had followed them against all advice, fell on him, her sobs of gratitude choking the cold air. The other men stood in stunned silence, but they weren't looking at the child. They were all staring at the tall, blind girl who had somehow led them there. She was kneeling beside the boy, brushing the matted hair from his face with hands as gentle as a prayer. For the first time, no one whispered the word curse. They whispered miracle, and that should have been the end of it. That should have been their happy ending. But as Emmeline tended to the boy, Silas saw something else. Tucked into the boy's coat was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. It was new, and on its underside, burned into the wood, was a familiar symbol. A circle with a jagged line cutting through it. The boy hadn't wandered off. He'd been led. He'd been bait. And the trap was just about to spring. A voice, smooth as polished stone, echoed from the rocks above them. A touching display. The lost lamb, found by the shepherdess. A man stepped out from the shadows of the cliffs. He was dressed like a preacher, in a long black coat, but his eyes were not filled with piety. They were cold and sharp, like chips of flint. He was not alone. Behind him, more men appeared, their faces hard, their hands resting on the pistols at their belts. They were the men from the road, the silencers. "You've led us on a merry chase, guardian," the preacher said, his eyes fixed on Emmeline. "But all roads lead home." He gestured to the cliffs around them. "This place is a sanctuary, is it not? A wellspring of your abomination." The townsfolk stared, confused. Mr. Withers stepped forward, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. "Who are you? What do you want with her?" The preacher smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "I am a cleanser, and she is a stain upon God's green earth." He looked directly at Silas. "You, rancher, you have no idea what you are harboring. You think she's an angel? She is the keeper of a gate that should have remained sealed forever." The preacher raised a hand. His men raised their rifles, aiming not at Emmeline, but at the terrified townsfolk. The boy was a test, a key to unlock this door, and now that it is open, the cleansing can begin. Silas moved to stand in front of Emmeline, his body a shield. He felt her hand on his back, not trembling, but steady. The warmth spread from her palm, but this time it felt different. It felt like power, like the low hum of a gathering storm. The miracle of finding the lost boy had turned into a nightmare. They weren't surrounded by grateful neighbors anymore. They were trapped in a canyon with a fanatical army, and the silent, blind girl at the center of it all was about to show them what she really was. The preacher's voice dripped with a false sympathy that made Silas's skin crawl. "You see, good people," he said to the terrified crowd, "this creature you call a miracle is nothing but a parasite. She draws her power from a sickness in the earth itself, a wellspring of corruption that has festered here for generations." He pointed a long, bony finger at Emmeline. "Her kind has plagued this land before. They call to the storm, they sour the milk, they lead children astray. They are an affront to the natural order." Old man Withers, holding his grandson tight, found his voice. "The boy's ankle. It's broken. She was helping him." "A predator's deception," the preacher sneered. "She heals with one hand what she poisons with the other. She is a guardian, yes, But she guards a blight, and we are the cure." His men took a step forward, their rifles ready. The townsfolk huddled together, trapped between the armed zealots and the strange girl they were only just beginning to understand. Silas stood his ground, his hand inching toward the pistol he now wore openly at his hip. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice a low growl. The preacher laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Oh, rancher, I have no intention of taking her. I intend to destroy her, and this entire unholy valley with her." He raised his hands as if in benediction. "Behold, the power of a true miracle!" One of his men shoved a torch into a fissure in the rock wall behind him. There was a low hiss, and then a faint, sickly green smoke began to pour out. It smelled of sulfur and decay. The preacher had packed the cliffs with blasting powder. He was going to bury them all. "Renounce your guardian!" he bellowed at the townsfolk, "or perish with her!" But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought their fear would make them turn on her. He didn't understand the kind of loyalty that is forged in the fires of a shared crisis. He didn't understand the bond between a lonely man and the impossible girl he had saved, and he had no idea what Emmeline was truly capable of. As the smoke billowed out, Emmeline stepped out from behind Silas. She raised her head, the blindfold still tied across her eyes, and faced the preacher. For the second time in her life with Silas, she opened her mouth. But it wasn't a low hum this time. It was a cry, a sound that was not human. It was the sound of the earth itself, given voice. It was the shriek of the wind, the rumble of the deep rock, the crack of lightning all woven into one pure resonant frequency. The sound wave hit the cliffs like a physical blow. The rocks didn't just tremble, they vibrated. They sang with the impossible note she held. The blasting powder, ignited by the torch, exploded, but it didn't cause a rockslide inwards, as the preacher had planned. Emmeline's cry directed the force of the blast outwards. Chunks of rock the size of wagons flew through the air, away from the trapped people, crashing down on the far side of the canyon. The preacher and his men were thrown from their feet, their rifles scattering as the very ground beneath them bucked and roared. The townsfolk stared in absolute awe and terror. The preacher had promised a miracle, and Emmeline had delivered one. In the ringing silence that followed the blast, the world was changed. The cliff face had been sheared away, revealing a deep cavern, and from within that cavern, a soft, pulsating blue light began to glow, bathing the entire canyon in an ethereal luminescence. The air grew warm and smelled of ozone and fresh earth. The wellspring was exposed. The preacher scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of crazed fury. "You see, the pit of heresy! Kill her now!" His men, dazed and confused, fumbled for their weapons. But something had shifted in the crowd. They had seen the preacher's cruelty, his willingness to sacrifice a child, his plan to murder them all. And they had seen Emmeline's power, a power she had used not to harm, but to protect. It was Old Man Withers who moved first. He shoved his grandson into his mother's arms and picked up a heavy rock. "She saved my boy twice," he roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "She saved us all! You ain't touching her!" That was all it took. The dam of fear broke. The other ranchers and townsmen surged forward, armed with rocks, fists, and a righteous anger that burned brighter than any torch. A desperate, brutal fight erupted at the mouth of the glowing cave. Silas didn't join the fray. His job was to protect the source. He drew his pistol and stood before Emmeline as the battle raged around them. She seemed to be drawing strength from the blue light of the wellspring. Her trembling had stopped. She stood tall and straight, a queen in her own strange kingdom. The preacher, seeing his men being overwhelmed by the furious townsfolk, let out a scream of rage and charged, not at the ranchers, but straight at Emmeline. He pulled a long, wicked-looking knife from his coat. Silas raised his pistol. He fired once. The shot was clean. The preacher crumpled to the ground, his mad crusade ending in the dirt at the foot of the very power he had sought to destroy. The fight drained out of his men as they saw their leader fall. The battle was over. Justice had been served, not by a lawman or a judge, but by a community of ordinary people who had finally learned to tell the difference between a monster and a miracle. In the aftermath, the canyon was quiet, lit by the strange blue glow of the wellspring. The preacher and his surviving men were bound with their own ropes. The townsfolk, bruised and bloody but resolute, gathered around Silas and Emmeline. Mr. Withers approached them, his hat in his hands. We didn't know," he stammered, his eyes on the glowing cave. "What is this place?" Emmeline turned her face toward him. She reached up with one hand and for the first time, slowly, deliberately, untied her blindfold. Her eyes were not the milky, sightless orbs everyone had assumed. They were a startling clear blue, the exact same color as the light pulsing from the wellspring, and they were focused directly on Withers, seeing him, truly seeing him, for the first time. She opened her mouth, and her voice, when it came, was not a cry or a hum. It was clear and soft, though rough from years of disuse. "It is a beginning," she said. The town, now bound by a shared secret and a shared act of defiance, pledged to protect Emmeline and the wellspring. The preacher and his men were handed over to a federal marshal from a distant territory, with a simplified story of a kidnapping and a failed ambush. No one ever mentioned the glowing cave or the girl who could command the very stones of the earth. Life on the prairie returned to a new kind of normal. The fear that had once poisoned the town was replaced by a quiet respect. People still kept their distance, but it was the distance one keeps from something sacred, not something cursed. Emmeline chose to keep the blindfold, not because she couldn't see, but because her sight was different. She saw the energy in living things, the sickness in the earth, the patterns of the wind. The world of normal light was a distraction. With the blindfold on, she could see what was real. Years rolled forward like the slow turning of the seasons. Storms came and went. Droughts tested the land, but the ranch and the town it protected always seemed to endure. The wellspring, its entrance now hidden by a rockfall that Emmeline had gently encouraged, seemed to enrich the land around it. The cattle were healthier, the crops grew taller. Silas built a sturdy bench beneath the big cottonwood tree where they sat most evenings, shoulder to shoulder, watching the prairie burn gold with the setting sun. She would take his hand in hers, and he would pour them both cups of tea, and in the comfortable hush between them, they felt completely, perfectly full. Travelers would sometimes find their way to the ranch, strange travelers who seemed lost, a boy who could talk to birds, a woman who could find water with a willow branch. They were drawn to the place, to the quiet hum of power that only they could feel, and at the Currian Ranch they found a safe haven. The legend of the silent giant sold at auction slowly transformed into the whispered legend of the guardian of the prairie. One twilight, after so many years had passed that Silas's hair was more silver than brown, she turned to him on the bench. Her blue eyes, which she now only uncovered for him, seemed to hold the light of every star in the sky. Her lips shaped the words slowly, the first she had spoken to him in years. "I do not need sound," she whispered, her voice still a little rough, like stones rubbing together. "Only you." Silas felt his own eyes burn with tears he wouldn't shed. His voice broke as he squeezed her hand. "I hear you," he answered. "I always have." The wind carried their shared silence like a hymn across the wide, endless horizon, and from that day on, when children asked their parents about the quiet, tall woman at the Currian Ranch, the answer was always simple. She was the one who heard with her heart, spoke without words, and loved without fear. The giant girl who was once sold as worthless had become the soul of the land itself. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode.